He saved a man mid-flight, but landed in handcuffs. An air marshal collapses. Shaq revives him, but beneath the seat lies a secret too dangerous to ignore. Framed by whispers, hunted by headlines, and betrayed by the system he trusted. What if the real threat wasn't the man who stood up, but the one who stayed silent? This isn't just a flight gone wrong, it's the truth fighting to land. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. What if the flight you boarded to escape your past carries you straight into it? The heat in Dallas sat heavy on the tarmac as passengers streamed into the terminal, most dragging wheeled luggage and last-minute stress behind them. Gate 43 buzzed with the usual hum of airport life, delayed announcements, overpriced coffee chatter, and the rustle of boarding passes. Among them stood a man hard to miss, yet clearly trying to disappear. Shaquille O'Neal, known to the world as Big Shaq. A mountain of a man. But that morning his frame carried more than muscle. There was a stillness in his eyes, a weariness not from age, but from experience. He boarded the flight not as a legend, not as a millionaire, but as a man who wanted to leave something behind. Maybe it was the way headlines had twisted his past. Maybe it was the echo of a courtroom he never belonged in. Maybe it was just the need for silence. First class was half full. He took the window seat, folding his 6-foot frame with practiced discomfort. A stewardess gave him a curious smile. Recognition, but didn't say a word. That suited him. Fame wore out faster than comfort on a coach seat. Beside him sat a businessman too wrapped in spreadsheets to notice. Shaq leaned back, closed his eyes, and waited for the lift. The flight, bound for Washington, D.C., promised 3 hours of peace, but life rarely honored promises. 30 minutes into the air, a soft cry broke the hum of the cabin. Row 4, a little girl, no more than 5, struggling with her ears popping. Her mother, frazzled and embarrassed, tried everything: juice box, stuffed animal, soft songs. Nothing worked. Passengers around her shifted in annoyance. The man in 1A groaned loud enough to be heard. Shaq unbuckled his belt. He crouched by her row, impossibly gentle for someone his size. He didn't speak right away, just offered his palm in a silent hello. The child stared at his massive hand, then placed her tiny one in it. Her cries dimmed. He pulled a silly face, eyes crossed, tongue out. She giggled. The mother mouthed a thank you, teary-eyed. He gave a nod, then returned to his seat. A ripple of respect spread quietly through the cabin. Not a show, just humanity. Outside, the clouds grew dense, swelling like a warning. The pilot announced mild turbulence ahead. Shaq gazed out the window, mind elsewhere on his mother Lucille, her voice steady over the years. Sometimes your silence speaks louder than the world's noise. He'd built his fortune helping others. Opened schools, fed neighborhoods. But one bad press scandal, twisted by racial bias, had stained his name. That's why this trip mattered. A meeting in D.C., a chance to fund a new initiative for exonerated inmates. He didn't just believe in second chances, he lived with them. But as the aircraft shook, so did the illusion of peace. A thud echoed from the back. Not loud, just strange. A man mid-40s tall, pale, wearing a government-issued jacket, stumbled into the aisle and clutched the overhead bin. Then he collapsed. Screams rose. A stewardess ran. Someone yelled for a doctor. Shaq shot up. He moved with urgency, not panic. As he reached the man, he saw the badge clipped to his belt. Federal Air Marshal. His face was pale, sweating. His breath shallow. Shaq dropped beside him, recalling the CPR training he'd taken years ago for youth camps. "Someone get oxygen," he said firmly. Passengers leaned over seats, filming. One even whispered, "Is that Big Shaq?" But the moment drowned in tension. He checked the man's airway, loosened his collar, and began chest compressions. The rhythm was steady. His massive hands moved like trained instruments, measured, exact, full of life-saving power. The Marshal gasped, then coughed. His eyes fluttered open. A collective breath filled the cabin. The flight crew moved in. A nurse on board stepped up. Shaq moved back, wiped his brow. No applause, just quiet awe. As he returned to his seat, someone clapped once. Then another. Soon the cabin broke into grateful applause. But not all hands joined. A few eyes stared, narrow and judging. Among them, a woman in 3C, with sharp eyes and a tighter jaw. Her name wasn't known yet, but her whisper would soon change everything. By the time the Marshal regained full consciousness, a sense of calm returned. Coffee resumed its drip. Air vents blew recycled peace. A soft groan in the aisle becomes the loudest moment of the flight. The hum of altitude had settled into the cabin like a lullaby when a faint groan slipped through the air, just enough to catch the edge of attention. It didn't come with a crash or panic, just a slumping sound, the kind that passes unnoticed unless you're tuned into the human rhythm of a confined space. A man near the emergency exit staggered forward, clutching at nothing. He was tall, lean, dressed in a dark blue jacket with a federal seal near the collar. Before he hit the ground, a stewardess shouted, and tension snapped across the plane like a dropped power line. Passengers froze, unsure if they were witnessing a medical emergency or something more sinister. Fear rides quietly in the air these days, and all it takes is one motion, one unexpected fall for panic to unpack itself. The man dropped to one knee, then tipped sideways into the aisle. Someone screamed. A tray hit the floor. The pilot's voice crackled through the speakers, calm but curt, requesting all passengers remain seated. From 1B, Shaq was already in motion. Not because he felt a need to be a hero, but because that's what he did. He moved when others paused. In 3 strides he was beside the man. The flight attendant tried to pull him back, but he gently waved her off. "He's not breathing right," Shaq said. The man's skin had gone pale, jaw slack. His fingers twitched, and his mouth fumbled for air. Shaq turned him on his back, checked the airway, then began compressions with the care of someone who had seen life fade before and refused to let it slip again. Each motion was deliberate, each breath that followed was earned. A badge hung loose from the man's belt, flipping over as he shifted. U.S. Federal Air Marshal. It changed the air instantly. A dozen passengers began filming. Not out of malice but habit. It wasn't enough to witness anymore. People needed proof. The plane didn't spiral into chaos. It hovered there. In that thick space between panic and awe, a nurse from row 8 rushed forward to assist. Shaq nodded, letting her check vitals while he kept pressure steady. The Marshal coughed, eyes fluttering open like storm shutters in the wind. He blinked, confused, then whispered something Shaq couldn't quite make out. "He's stable," the nurse said, "but we'll need to land soon." The lead flight attendant radioed the cockpit. Passengers applauded softly, a reluctant cheer, rising not just for the survival, but for the man who made it happen. But not all claps felt genuine. In 3C, a woman, elegant, early 40s sharp suit, whispered to the man beside her. She had watched the scene with calculated focus, and now her attention was locked on Shaq. Her voice was quiet, but the word suspicious wasn't. Shaq returned to his seat, wiping sweat from his brow with a napkin. He didn't seek praise, just peace. The businessman beside him gave a stiff nod, then went back to typing. Shaq leaned back, but couldn't shake the look that woman gave him. The kind that wasn't fear but certainty, as if she had already made up her mind about him. A few minutes later, the same woman stood and walked toward the rear galley. When she returned, she whispered something to a flight attendant. Their eyes followed her pointing finger, straight to Shaq. A clipboard was taken out. Something was noted. In the galley, murmurs began to build. The nurse was called back for questioning. The air marshal, now conscious, mumbled about feeling lightheaded, before blacking out, but he said nothing else. When he asked who helped him, the flight attendant only pointed. "That man," she said. "Big Shaq." From row 12, a teenager who had filmed the event zoomed in on the badge again, screenshotting it. He caught something strange, a date that didn't match. He frowned but said nothing, just texted the image to his group chat, with the caption, "Yo, this Marshal's badge looks weird." Back in first class, the energy shifted. Shaq sensed it. It wasn't the turbulence. It was quieter than that. Eyes on him, staff avoiding eye contact. The man who had just saved a life now felt like he was under invisible lights. Not stage lights. Interrogation ones. The pilot announced an early landing into Washington, D.C. for medical precaution. But the tension in the crew's voices said more than policy. They were preparing for something else. Shaq sat still, hands folded, muscles tight. He looked out the window and thought of his mother again, of the nights she worked 2 shifts just to keep him on the court, of how she always warned, "Don't matter how tall you stand, baby, they'll still try to cut you down." Passengers gathered their things early, murmuring and glancing. A few whispered thanks to Shaq as they passed. Others avoided him. But the whispers from 3C lingered the loudest. Because that woman wasn't afraid. She was planning something. A low murmur drifted through the cabin once boarding had ceased, like distant thunder before a storm. The flight attendants moved with calculated efficiency, their faces masks of professionalism, but tension seeped in around the edges. Suddenly, a voice slipped through the galley in barely more than a whisper, yet it carried weight. He planted something. The words landed like a punch, invisible but powerful. Shaquille O'Neal, seated quietly, felt a shift that went far beyond the gentle hum of turbulence. He glanced sideways, catching the eyes of the flight attendant in row 3C, the woman whose gaze had lingered. She caught his look and looked away, but Shaq knew suspicion had taken root. Passengers buzzed with curiosity, though most shielded their interest behind polite restraint. Then came the search. The crew, alerted by the whisper, returned to the rear of the aircraft. What followed was an orchestrated unfold. A cabin of strangers, coaxed into watching as something troubling emerged. Under the air marshal's seat, someone found a duffel bag. The seal cracked and vials tumbled out. Glass instruments of unknown use, several wrapped in sterile paper, accompanied by folders thick with documents. Cameras flicked on, phones rose. The uncertainty in that moment caused the cabin air to taste sour. Shaq's heart hammered. It wasn't fear for himself at first. It was confusion. The man he'd saved, the so-called hero in federal black, was now at the center of something darker. Was everything a lie? Authorities herded passengers away from the object, and the flight crew sealed off the rear cabin. They asked Shaq to stand. He complied, his tall frame mechanical amidst the crowd. But then came the command, place your hands behind your back. Shaq bloomed inside him. No buckle, no handcuffs, just a professional but firm request. The crew apologized, softly, precaution. The irony felt cruel. Just an hour ago, Shaq was being thanked. Now he was being treated like a suspect. Panic didn't wash over him. Instead, he felt a cold clarity sharpen within. This was not just a misstep. This was a setup. Passengers whispered about what they'd seen. A few uttered, "He's black," in tones too quiet to fully hear but loud enough in intent. A hush, then the crackle of the ventilation system filled the silence. Outside, the clouds were thickening again. This time not by altitude, but by something unseen. The flight attendant from row 3C hovered nearby, her eyes darting toward Shaq, as though she searched for validation of her suspicion. He stood by the window, one hand resting on the frame, looking out at the white expanse below. Was it ironic that a man who saved a life was now being restrained? He felt his muscles shift, braced, but his mind stayed calm. He'd been here before. Twisted narratives, headlines, malicious whispers. Each false accusation felt like a slap. Each dismissed defense, a scar, yet his soul held firm. The flight's forward movement mimicked the world, unstoppable, indifferent. But this, Shaq realized, was the real turbulence, not physical, but societal. Racism wrapped itself in protocol and prejudice. Kindness became a vulnerability. Public hero became public threat. Back in that constricted space, he knelt slightly to fit into the cabin's angle, his frame filling more space than he would have liked. An unwilling display. Crew members moved with efficiency, their eyes glued to handheld scanners and checklists. One attendant read aloud from the bag's inventory, unknown vials, classified documents, no owner. The word black wasn't said, but it hung in the air. The marshal, revived, remained seated, but silent, his breathing slow, his gaze unfocused. He didn't reach for the bag, even though it lay under his seat. Either he couldn't, or he wouldn't. That too felt consequential. A stewardess approached Shaq, voice trembling. "Sir, you're technically under quarantine until landing." He nodded, stepping aside as two attendants guided him to a bulkhead seat in the front. The passengers watched, some with sympathy, others with relief. Cameras lowered, whispers ceased. The divide between them and him grew. Shaq sat restrained by nothing but implied authority. He looked out the window at the skies ahead, at the earth far below, at the thin line between altitude and attitude. His thoughts drifted home to Lucille, his mother, whose steady hands taught him that innocence doesn't always protect you, but integrity does. He thought of his daughter Mira, and his wife Shawnee, waiting for him in D.C. He thought of the meeting he'd had set up to secure funding for the innocent scholarships he'd started for wrongly accused youth. All that good overlooked in a breath. Meanwhile, the passengers resumed their flights, some with sleep masks, some with tension still lacing the air beneath their calm. The flight attendants rechecked overhead bins, smoothed uniforms, and retrieved the marshal's duffel bag. It was zip-tied, sealed, tagged evidence. The cabin felt smaller now. Shaq's presence tightened it further. He could feel the gazes through his back even without turning. Filmmakers, commentators, silent judges. Flight descended. The roar of the engines dropped. The plane slowed as if undoing what had launched it. Shaq's breath deepened. He wasn't sitting for a mistake he didn't make. He had helped a man in distress, but the narrative had flipped him. Framed, quarantined, mute, and yet through it all, something kept him steady. His own truth, held deep in his bones, deeper than the whispers snaking through the cabin. Landing lights flickered on. The plane touched the tarmac of DC. The growling of the engines ceased, replaced by the hiss of the brakes. The intercom came alive. Remain seated until authorities board. We will be deplaning by rows. The calm in the announcement was robotic. The spirit, the warmth had been sucked from those words. Shaq straightened, exhaled, and locked eyes with the flight attendant from 3C as she led him forward. There was no empathy in her glance, only a grim nod of duty. As the first officer opened the forward door, a hush fell, cameras raised again, not for applause, but for evidence. Shaq stepped forward, tall and composed. The crew parted silently, presenting a corridor in which he'd walk. Was this justice? Was this prejudice? Only time would tell which would land first. His guilt or his redemption. The moment the wheels hit the ground, the cuffs hit his wrists. The cabin lull broke only when the flight doors opened. Bright daylight spilled in, but the warmth was false-strained, forced, as if it had to make up for the tension. No sooner had the jet bridge connected than airport security in Navy uniforms and federal badges flooded aboard. Shaq, still reeling from the earlier humiliation, stood as the lead officer approached with zip ties. He didn't resist, though every muscle in his 6'11" frame tensed. He offered his wrists, but kept his gaze steady and his posture upright, dignity intact, despite the tools of degradation. Suspected tampering with federal materials, the officer said plainly, voice flat. Shaq's chest tightened. Passengers craned necks, phones poised in hand. Some faces showed pity. Others wore relief, as if his innocence or guilt would confirm their own beliefs. The elegant woman from row 3C stood nearby, observing his ordeal with quiet calculation. No sign of the warm applause that once greeted him during the flight, replaced now with murmurs and murmured justification for the officer's actions. Outside, protesters swarmed behind barricades, uninvited yet inevitable. Half held signs declaring "Free Big Shaq," the other half shared hashtags demanding justice for the compromised air marshal. News cameras flashed, capturing every angle. The scene was cinematic, an unjust spectacle of burden and bravado. Shaq's heart pounded, not from resistance but obligation. He knew the world was watching not just the arrest but how he would respond. At the terminal exit, the lead officer motioned for him to follow. Zip-tied wrists, hands at his sides. He walked past the crowd under the hum of media buzz, flashbulbs erupting like tonal punctuation in a tense novel. One officer whispered in his ear, "Stay quiet." His silence became his shield. They moved through corridors to a waiting van. Shaq climbed into the back, his frame nearly filling the seat. It smelled of vinyl and fear. Is theirs, the public's. As the door closed, he met a stoic glance from the marshal, who'd collapsed. The man showed no gratitude, no guilt, just inscrutable reservation. The precinct was stark, a building halfway between courthouse austerity and institutional intimidation. They led Shaq to an interrogation room. Harsh lighting, a single table, 2 chairs. Across from him sat a woman, clipboard in hand, her posture tight with professionalism. She introduced herself as Special Agent Callahan. Her voice carried sharp edges. "Mr. O'Neill, you have the right to remain silent." Her tone added unspoken lines. "You'll need more than money and fame to rewrite this narrative." Shaq's jaw clenched, but he remained silent until she asked. She offered no coffee, no pleasantries, just documents. "You were seen handling the marshal. You had access to his seat. This bag was beneath it." "Explain." He inhaled, then exhaled calm. "I did what any human would do. I assisted a man in need." She tilted her head, no hint of empathy. "And yet you touched evidence before we arrived." He paused, held her gaze. I didn't know there was evidence under his seat. She scribbled. You're a public figure, Mr. O'Neill. This doesn't help. Shaq leaned forward, voice quiet but firm. My public record is full of helping people. My public presence shouldn't undermine my private integrity. Callahan set down her pen, studying him. Narratives change when they profit someone, especially someone famous. The words hung in the air, barbed, legal, procedural. Shaq felt the first real swell of fear, not for himself, but for his wife Shawnee, daughter Mira, and the movement he was trying to lead. The symbolism wasn't lost, a black hero framed in front of America, struggling to breathe under suspicion. In the waiting room, more officers escorted a man they identified as Passenger 117, the Whisperer. He wore an anxious look, shoulders hunched. He met Shaq's eyes, then looked away. Shaq watched as the man was led past. The narrator in his mind saw a script being written, not the one he'd hoped for. Outside, cameras panned over protest signs and crowd noise, some cheering, some condemning. Social media lit up. News anchors debated not just what happened on the flight, but what this arrest meant: racial profiling, misuse of power, or rightful response. Shaq's face in cuffs became a symbol for multiple causes, none of them simple. Back in the interrogation room, Callahan returned. Questions over. You'll be held until bail can be arranged. She gave no timeline. Shaq nodded, voice low. Thank you. Handcuffed once more, he stood and was led away. The weight of institution and expectation on every step. As he passed reporters, he kept silent. His silence told more than any defense. In the holding cell, Shaq leaned back against the wall, alone. He let his hands fall free, wrist wounds already forming. He closed his eyes and thought of Lucille's voice. When the world puts chains on you, remember they're afraid of what you can do freed. He thought of his daughter's smile, of Shawnee's unwavering belief, and he stayed quiet, not in shame, but in solidarity with truth. The cell doors clanged. A guard entered and dropped a plate of food. The lights were harsh, shadows hard. Shaq didn't flinch. He had been here before, in his mind, in the press, in the courts, yet here he was, still free inside. As he ate silently, he realized the story had changed. No longer just a man on a flight helping someone. Now it was a narrative test, not of what he did, but of who he was. And he knew the stakes were higher than clearing his name. This was bigger. It was about truth. It was about purpose. The storm inside him had settled into resolve, and he was ready. The fluorescent lights in the interrogation wing felt colder than the air outside, painting Shaq's reflection on the grimy linoleum floors. He sat across from a stone-faced detective, whose silence carried more weight than any accusation. As the clock ticked behind him, Shaq closed his eyes and remembered his mother Lucille's voice, steady and unwavering. They can shift the stories about you, baby, but they can't steal your truth. That phrase echoed now through the hush of the station, resonating in a space where appearances mattered more than substance. In one flashback, he was in Compton, handing over a check to a local youth center he'd started when he still played for the Lakers. The kids surrounded him in a messy circle, faces lit with hope, gratitude filling the air. Yet news cameras that day captured not giving, but spectacle. A headline later read, "Lakers star plays Good Sam," more derisive than celebratory. Although he was famous, Shaq had never felt more invisible, his kindness overshadowed by his celebrity. A guard slid his chair back, interrupting Shaq's reverie, and instructed him to follow. The questioning continued. Each question circled back to the bag beneath the air marshal's seat. The vials, the documents. It became a loop of insinuation, innocent hands tainted by presence. As he answered calmly, Shaq's mind drifted to his past. Moments he'd rather forget, resentful reminders of loyalty misunderstood and generosity unappreciated. "You did good up there," Victor began, voice quiet but earnest. "Saving that guy meant something." Shaq offered a small nod. Victor continued. "But that Marshal, he wasn't alone. Heard whispers. He was being watched close. Not just skies watched, but ground, tracking his moves." His tone shifted. "You didn't just save him, big man. You stumbled into something bigger." Back in the present, the guard ushered Shaq into another cramped cell adjoining a shared common area. The walls were yellowed with smoke stains and old graffiti. The air felt thick with confinement. A man in pilot uniform sat slumped on the far bench, head in his hand. Shaq recognized him. Victor Hayes, first officer on a regional flight, detained on unrelated charges. Victor glanced up with tired eyes. Recognizing Shaq, he straightened and nodded. Another memory surfaced. A gala in Chicago, celebrating his philanthropy. He was introduced, applause booming, black tie elegance all around. Yet later, after dinner, he was asked to be the African-American face for authenticity, then quickly dismissed from panels when deeper policy questions skirted his wealth. He felt the sting then. A beloved icon turned token. A surreal reminder that even when the world applauded, they drew lines around him. Shaq's heart skipped. The weight of his actions pressed upon him. He had intended only to save a life, not disrupt an operation. Now he was trapped at the center of something he could barely comprehend. He asked Victor what he saw, and Victor detailed how security teams had followed the Marshal onto the tarmac, how he boarded in a private SUV, not through public check-ins. Whole lot more money spent on his flight than typical, Victor said, eyes clouded. Then he collapses in the mid-cabin. This information shifted the narrative. Shaq realized he had become collateral in a covert story, a liability framed to deflect scrutiny. The realization twisted inside him. What if he'd been set up? What if the vials were meant to frame someone bigger, and his saving of the man had forced a rewrite? He thought of the injustice. How quickly saving a life can be turned into a crime. Perception mattered more than truth. He recalled Lucille's lessons. Power didn't mean safety. Race didn't mean respect. Rescuing him had been instinct, not strategy. Night began to seep through the high barred window. Shaq leaned against the wall, letting exhaustion settle in. He thought of his daughter, Myra, giggling at the playground, of Shawnee pacing at home, worried. He prayed their fears wouldn't become part of his story. Only one thing remained certain. He would not let them spin this into a scandal. Integrity wasn't negotiable. It was essential. Across the cell, Victor stretched and offered a hand. "Keep your head, man. They'll see." Shaq took it, grateful. It wasn't justice. Not yet. It was solidarity. In that fractured corner of detention, truth found its quiet ally. Outside, clocks ticked. Flights landed. Life carried on. But within these walls, the seed of a reckoning took root. Shaq closed his eyes, breathing in the dim hope that justice wasn't dead. It was waiting for someone to tell the real story. What if the man you saved wasn't a protector, but the threat itself? News outlets light up the moment morning breaks over D.C., and with it a stunning revelation. The Air Marshal Shaq saved is not who authorities claimed. Screens flash his name, someone citizens never recognized, and it's followed by accusations of espionage. Headlines read, "Federal agent or foreign actor." A confidential leak confirms his badge was fabricated. The image of the man Shaq tended to dough crawls across every platform. The revelation spreads like wildfire, shattering public perception overnight. Gone is the narrative of a life-saving hero. Instead, footage and documents from the leak allege he was under suspicion for passing classified material. Investigators were tracking him for months, monitoring his movements, intercepting communication. His sudden collapse mid-flight, the bag of vials and documents, now pieces of a deeper puzzle. But the shift in perception doesn't benefit Shaq as much as one might expect. He still faces obstruction charges for allegedly contaminating evidence by handling the threat. The authorities argue it complicates their case. Social media transforms into a battleground. Black-owned publications and civil rights groups stand by Shaq, citing racial bias in his quick framing. They resurrect footage of him coaching underprivileged kids on weekends, building community centers in poor neighborhoods, and consistently speaking out against injustice. Contrasting voices emerge from mainstream outlets, suggesting a celebrity can't be above suspicion. Calls for his immediate release intensify, but so do whispers about his guilt. Public discourse fractures, praising heroism, projecting fear, or demanding proof. Across that chasm, Lucille O'Neill arrives in D.C., a steady presence against the storm. At the courthouse steps, she stands among supporters, hands clasped, voice unwavering, as she meets cameras. "My son," she says, "saved a life. That's what he does." But your headlines change faster than facts. Your tweets don't replace his integrity. Her words land firmly. Your heart will save you, even when the law won't. Emotion ripples through the crowd. Some eyes fill with tears. Others stiffen with resolve. All of them hearing a mother's unwavering faith. He speaks not to defend himself, but to assert truth. His tone is measured, resonating with sincerity. "I performed CPR. I did it because he needed help. If the bag was evidence, I didn't know. I don't litigate bravery. Callahan doesn't respond with empathy, only with protocol search terms. Meanwhile, at the precinct, Shaq sits restrained, not by zip ties this time, but by mounting doubt and legalese. Agent Callahan reappears, typing notes on an iPad, her expression unreadable. The focus has shifted, she says, acknowledging the leak. But the obstruction charges remain. You interfered with an active investigation. Shaq listens. As the hearing adjourns, Shaq steps into the sunlight. He pauses to look at the crowd, supporters holding signs reading "Truth above all," and "Shaq is innocent," and then to those shouting, "Let justice run its course." A moment stretches. He exhales slowly. His voice, amplified by a microphone held by a local journalist, is calm and solemn. "What I did was human. It won't always fit your narrative, but I stand by it." From the courthouse crowd to the precinct walls, emotions surge. Protesters chant outside, some clashing, not physically, but verbally, with counter-protesters chanting "Justice first" and "Presume innocent." Journalists hound Shawnee O'Neill, who steps forward with resilience. She recounts their family's dedication to community, revealing late nights organizing food drives, advocating for prisoners' rights, and promoting education. She speaks of Mira's admiration, of her daughter asking, "Mommy, why are they saying Daddy is a bad guy?" The question, simple and heartbreaking, travels across media networks slower than the memes, but louder than the narrative. The legal system moves forward. A bail hearing is set. Shaq enters the courtroom surrounded by attorneys and advocates. His presence is imposing yet vulnerable, like a cathedral of compassion under siege. Lucille takes a seat behind him, her eyes steady. Reporters crowd the barricades, their cameras clicking like anxious hearts. Meanwhile, the trial will require parsing espionage leaks, timeline inconsistencies, and allegations of racial framing, a labyrinth. In the press frenzy and courtroom lights, Shaq braces for what comes next. Not as a superstar, but as a man willing to stand for truth while facing the weight of public uncertainty and institutional rigor. The suspense tightens. He waits. Justice and redemption must still find their flight path. The next wave is suspenseful. The jury selection looms. Social discourse deepens, and Shaq's reputation hangs in the balance. Every turn of public sentiment feels like a turning point in a courtroom drama. But through the chaos, Lucille's words echo. Your heart will save you, even when the law won't. When the system sees color before character, justice comes in grayscale. Simultaneously, the defense introduced archived interviews, showing Shaq's charitable legacy, footage from 5 years ago, when he handed over a check to a youth food bank in Newark, standing among children he'd helped feed, the camera capturing their joyous smiles. There was the clip of him opening a free tutoring center for at-risk teens in Memphis, his voice steady as he said, "Education should not be a luxury. It should be a right." The effect was subtle but powerful, a man of real substance, not a headline. In the courtroom buzzing with fluorescent lights and whispered legal strategy, Shaq's defense team mounted an unexpected offensive. They brought forward facial recognition experts, who had reviewed the in-flight security footage. The timeline they reconstructed was meticulous. Shaq had moved directly to the collapsing Marshal, performed life-saving compressions, and stepped back, never touching the bag under the seat. Yet in the prosecutor's presentation, the footage had been selectively clipped, the moments of proximity exaggerated. The defense displayed side-by-side comparisons, showing how algorithms used by security systems tended to flag black men as threats in similar contexts, bias baked into the code itself. The courtroom murmured. The system that promised objectivity had betrayed its own flaws, exposing a warped logic that judged Shaq's race before his action. Meanwhile, behind closed doors, a key witness came forward. A flight attendant, one of the few who had originally thanked Shaq, requested anonymity and spoke with Shaq's lawyer. She revealed she had been pressured by unnamed airport security personnel to modify her initial statement. "They told me to say I felt afraid," she said, voice trembling. "I wasn't. I was grateful. But I was told the narrative needed fear." Her confession punctured the prosecution's version of events and painted a picture of institutional manipulation. It showed that the bias didn't reside only in algorithms and headlines. It came from people too, leveraging power against truth. News of these revelations leaked overnight. Opinion pieces emerged, questioning the integrity of airport security practices and exploring how bias impacts black figures, even renowned ones. Headlines shifted from Shaq, suspected of tampering, to Shaq vs. system, racial bias in security algorithms. The social media pendulum swung, turning doubt into outrage, and amplifying calls for accountability. In the gallery, Shaq watched the drama unfold. He remained composed, arms folded lightly, dignity intact. His lawyer approached him during a recess. Softly, she said, "We're dismantling their evidence, piece by piece." He nodded, thoughtful. He thought of Lucille's words, "They'll judge you by your covers before they read your chapters." Now the courtroom was starting to turn pages. Back in the courtroom, Shaq's defense rested its case on one final argument. The character witness, a community leader, took the stand, recounting nights when Shaq personally cooked meals for unhoused veterans, giving them respect more than just food. He spoke of Shaq walking miles to break ground on a literacy program in rural Georgia. His voice trembled slightly at the memory. The room, previously divided by speculation, softened. A senior prosecutor rose again, attempting to salvage credibility by questioning the flight attendant's motives. Could she be mistaken? Research shows memory can shift. But his question landed without force, softer than expected. The defense attorney responded firmly. Pressure isn't suggestion, it's coercion. Saying she felt afraid after being told to does not become truth by repetition. The judge's gaze fixed ahead. Steady. The moment felt symbolic. Truth confronting systemic falsehoods in a courtroom illuminated by cold lights and warmer justice. Outside the courthouse, supporters raised new signs. Algorithms aren't always right, and facts over fear. The public discourse had matured. The fight was no longer just for Shaq. It was for every person forced into a boxed version of themselves. Shaq's eyes locked on the witness, the words resonating with his own convictions. He felt in that moment the weight of thousands who'd believed in him, who depended on him, who wouldn't let this story end in distortion. The courtroom exhaled, collectively leaning in to hear a fuller picture than any algorithm had ever known. As recess was called for deliberation, a hush fell. Outside, progressive activists held a silent vigil. The message was clear. Justice upholds those who don't expect it, not the algorithmic assumptions that discount humanity before understanding it. Inside, Shaq stood steady. The fight was far from over, but the scales had begun to shift, and that shift, he understood, was bigger than him. From courthouse steps to college campuses, a wave of support for Shaq surged like a tidal force. Early morning rallies set social media ablaze under the banner, "Free Big Shaq," and thousands showed up, with handmade signs and chants echoing across cityscapes. They weren't coming for a celebrity, they were coming for a father, a philanthropist, an emblem of compassion. Civil rights leaders spoke against the injustice of a hero framed by fear. A renowned youth advocate compared Shaq's ordeal to past injustices inflicted on black leaders, unjustly smeared by institutions. The sentiment was clear. This was about more than Shaq. It was about systemic failure. A city rallies, not for a basketball legend, but for the man behind the fame. On college lawns, students organized teach-ins about racial profiling and digital bias. Professors used Shaq's case to illustrate modern inequities, pressing on how algorithms can reinforce old prejudices, how public perception can collapse lives. Nightly candlelight vigils formed in city parks. A network of grassroots organizers coordinated solidarity events across the nation. The movement echoed through classrooms, churches, and council halls. Every speech and banner reminded people he was more than Big Shaq. He was a man reaching for justice. Celebrities added fuel to the fire. A famous actor posted a video calling the charges a disgrace to every life saved. An NFL quarterback shared stories of Shaq's mentorship in youth football camps. Their voices gave more resonance. This wasn't a spectacle, it was a reckoning. Media coverage shifted tone. News outlets that had led with suspicion now ran features on the disparity between proof and prejudice. Commentary shows debated how fame intersects with race in judicial systems. The nuance grew richer, more urgent. Yet as the cheers grew louder, so did the threats. Anonymous emails, rife with racial slurs and warnings of violence, flooded Shaq's defense team. "You'll never play anywhere again," one read. "Leave quietly." His attorney scrambled to preserve evidence, filing police reports and escalating security measures. The juxtaposition was cruel. On one hand, unity and hope. On the other, hatred and intimidation. They came with placards but also with poison. The revelation rippled through the protest movement. Supporters seamlessly folded the news into their banners. Expose Liberty Shield became a rallying cry. College protests turned investigative, volunteering to help track traction and connections. Civil rights groups demanded congressional hearings. Federal agencies quietly opened probes into the firm. America, fractured and furious, began to see the bigger plot. Behind the scenes, Shaq's legal team uncovered evidence implicating Passenger 17 in a private security firm. Liberty Shield Solutions, linked to shady political actors. Documents revealed that Liberty Shield had contracts with campaign operatives seeking to manipulate public sentiment during election seasons. Passenger 17, whose name remained withheld, was a former operative, skilled in misinformation techniques. The bag under the Marshal's seat, it turned out, contained surveillance equipment designed to record conversations covertly. Nothing more suspicious than political espionage. The intended victim, the Air Marshal, whose identity was fabricated to mask covert operation. An investigative journalist published exposés. Emails within Liberty Shield referenced setting up false incidents mid-flight to create fear-driven narratives. Passenger 17 had flown routes known to influence political hot zones. Their motive to create a scenario that justified increased surveillance funding. The plan derailed the moment Shaq intervened, saving their pawn in the game, but unintentionally spotlighting the truth. But the threats remained. Emails kept coming, each more vile than the last. His guard increased. Volunteers formed online watch committees. Every rally now included security detail and legal observers. The shift was stark. Solidarity demanded protection now. Shaq, still awaiting trial, received word of these developments via his legal team. His eyes welled with relief and purpose. This wasn't just vindication. It was accountability. He watched from his temporary holding room as phones lit up with news alerts. Top story: private security firm's political espionage exposed. He thought of Lucille's words, "Your heart will save you," and felt them pulse with truth here. That night, as a vigil ended under street lamps and faint breeze, Shawnee spoke to a gathering outside the courthouse. Her words carried hope and gravity. "We ask not just for my husband's freedom, but for this country to confront the systems that nearly destroyed him. Let this fracture become our renewal." Applause rolled across the crowd, varied and determined. In that division, in that clash of darkness and light, something stirred. A collective understanding that justice wasn't a brand. It was a commitment, not to fame, nor fear, but to truth and the people. Shaq stood at the eye of that storm, his presence quiet but resolute. Whatever would come next, whether courtroom or verdict, would not be his alone. It would be America's reckoning. Amid the storm of voices, hope, outrage, fear, the story took on a new dimension. It wasn't simply Shaq's fight anymore. It was a mirror reflecting America's fractured trust in its own systems. It was a moment where a country had to choose whose narratives to believe. Heroes who act, or shadows who plot. The accuser vanishes, but not before leaving behind one final breadcrumb. Just as momentum built toward Shaq's court date, news broke that Passenger 117 had gone missing. His apartment, located in an upscale DC complex, was found empty, bed unmade, bag packed, phone abandoned, and flight manifests wiped clean from his hard drives. Surveillance footage from the building's lobby showed a tall figure in a hooded coat glancing at cameras just before midnight, then vanishing into the night. The disappearance sent a jolt through Shaq's defense team. Their key accuser had fled, and so had the story he'd carried. Simultaneously, investigators discovered that critical flight records, aircraft logs, seat assignments, timestamps, had been remotely deleted from the airline's server hours before Passenger 117 was declared missing. The deletion coincided with his apartment break-in, suggesting a coordinated erasure of evidence. Panic built on both sides of the courtroom fence. For prosecutors, it meant their main witness had disappeared along with the records. For the defense, it meant secrets were being buried. Shaq watched the media coverage with a calm gaze, understanding that another twist in the tale once again reframed the narrative. Amidst the chaos, a whistleblower within the airline approached Shaq's lead attorney undercover in a dimly lit parking garage. They handed over a small, weathered thumb drive. "Encrypted," they whispered. "It's from the plane's cabin security cam." Even as Shaq's lawyer tucked the drive into a secure envelope, her eyes widened. It could be the conclusive evidence they desperately needed. Back at the defense office, tech experts worked through the night to decrypt the footage. When they played the file, Shaq saw himself in grainy black and white, leaning over an unconscious man, administering CPR, stepping aside as the flight attendant took over, never touching the bag under the seat. It corroborated everything Shaq had said for weeks. Relief pulsed through the team, but they also exchanged wary glances. This wasn't the end. It was a fracture point. Hours later, encryption revealed another layer. Audio. Not just Shaq's actions, but voices, quiet conversations before the Marshal's collapse. Better sound equipment separated murmurs that at first sounded unremarkable, but then one line stood out. Play the hero. Ensure he's caught. The voice was distorted but familiar. The tone exactly like Passenger 117's, recognizable to those who had cross-referenced his recorded call logs. It suggested a setup, with Shaq cast as the unwitting patsy. When the defense presented the audio transcript to the court, the judge paused, her expression tight. The audio transcript, though anonymized, painted the accuser as orchestrator. Murmurs swirled through the court. Prosecutors stood, visibly unsettled. Still, some question remained. Who had orchestrated this? And why? The absence of Passenger 117 left his motives and affiliations unanswered. Shaq's lawyer requested a subpoena for any related communications, and the judge granted it, ordering digital forensics on the deleted flight logs and any server backups. The courtroom, once frozen in tension, thawed slightly as hope returned to Shaq's side. But the deeper conspiracy sent a chill through everyone. Someone powerful feared their plan unraveling. Outside, media outlets shifted tone again, from celebrity under suspicion to setup suspected. Who is Passenger 117? Calls for investigation flooded in. Civil rights groups demanded a full inquiry. Shaq, still under legal supervision, appeared composed as he walked out of the hearing, eyes focused forward, demeanor resolute. Lucille stood nearby, her face a portrait of quiet strength. Yet beneath that calm, the truth had grown darker. Passenger 117's disappearance didn't close the case. It expanded it into a labyrinth of cover-ups. The threat wasn't gone. It was lurking behind locked doors and deleted files. In the next chapter, they all knew, would be even more consequential. As Shaq stepped into the quiet afternoon light outside the courthouse, he felt the weight of that unknown. The game had changed. Not just about clearing his name, but exposing those who hid in the shadows. And Shaq, the man with the heart, was prepared to follow it wherever it led. Some truths need altitude to be seen clearly. The decryption team at the law firm had pulled every string, reconstructed deleted files, and stitched together every fragment of footage salvaged from the plane's mid-flight cameras. What emerged was a sequence so damning and meticulous that it could not be dismissed as coincidence or error. There, in shaky frame-by-frame slow motion, appeared the so-called Air Marshal. With a small syringe concealed in his jacket, he plunged it into his own arm. His hands moved with trepidation, eyes darting to the camera, then down to the vial. He paused, inhaled sharply, and the next moment collapsed theatrically into unconsciousness. The act didn't look like emergency. It looked like theater. A staged breakdown. A calculated collapse. The bag of vials and documents sealed the scene. But the footage revealed more. Moments before the injection, two other figures unidentified exchanged briefcases in the galley. The Marshal's collapse served as the distraction, the diversion, allowing that exchange to go unnoticed by cameras and crew. In that moment, Shaq, doing what he does best, intervened inadvertently, disrupting a covert operation that had been unfolding above the clouds. When the defense presented the video and audio in court, complete with expert testimony, the effect was seismic. The judge leaned forward, intrigued and unmoved by prior claims. The prosecution tried to reframe it as unverified angles, but the video's clarity spoke for itself. Federal agents, mid-air operatives, whatever their role, they had hitched their entire operation to the collapse, and the collapse wasn't medical. It was deliberate. Media frenzy ignited again. Headlines shifted overnight. Conspiracy exposed at 30,000 feet, and Big Shaq interrupts covert operation. News anchors replayed the footage, some with a sense of shock, others with relief. Pundits debated the implications. Was this some clandestine intelligence exchange? A geopolitical handshake hidden in plain sight aboard a domestic flight? Questions erupted like fireworks. But amid the frenzy, one thing remained stagnant: the system. Despite video evidence that exonerated Shaq and indicted unknown operatives, the charges weren't immediately dropped. The prosecutor's office moved intentionally slow, releasing statements about ongoing investigations and national security concerns. Shaq's attorney, exhausted yet resolute, confronted the press. How long must a black man wait for the truth to matter? She demanded, voice rising above the courtroom's drone of official word-speak. Her question carried the weight of generations, of men and women whose vindication moved too slowly through systems built on prejudice and power. It spoke of frustration with institutions that exalt video evidence, unless it vindicates those they seek to protect. Shaq's statement was quiet but potent. In front of cameras outside the court, he said, "I didn't ask for headlines. I saved a life, and I did it again, when the world needed me to expose the real threat. But this isn't just about me. It's about every person of color who has waited for proof that should have never been withheld." He paused, scanning reporters' expectant faces. "We demand more than apologies. We demand accountability." The public reaction pivoted again. Supporters rallied behind Shaq's words. Civil rights organizations filed petitions urging immediate dismissal of charges and full investigations into the flight's clandestine operation. Meanwhile, critics cautioned against politicizing national security. But with footage this conclusive, levers of delayed justice began to shift. Inside the courtroom, the judge signaled a continuance. Prosecutors conceded they needed to reevaluate their approach in light of the new evidence, but declined to drop charges immediately. They cited national security protocols. The defense team, visibly fatigued, prepared motions for expedited dismissal and deeper oversight of the covert actors. From the press gallery, Lucille watched her sons fight, institutional inertia versus irrefutable truth. She remembered her earlier charge, "Your heart will save you." Now, she thought, it had done more than save, it had revealed. But she also knew the cost of systems that slow even in the face of clarity. Outside, as Shaq exited the building, cameras flashing and supporters chanting, one sign stood out: justice at altitude, now. The message was clear. The fight for truth was above the clouds and beyond the courtroom. The question hanging in the air, echoing Shaq's lawyer, was not if the charges would be dropped, but when the system would catch up to the truth it already held. In that moment, justice wasn't distant. It was in motion, measured, reluctant, but undeniably underway. The flight path had shifted, and for once it carried more than a jetliner. It carried accountability. Sometimes, justice doesn't come from the court. It comes from the crowd. The courtroom crackled with anticipation as murmurs washed over the gallery like an incoming tide. Reporters repositioned cameras, advocates straightened signs. Shaq sat quietly, his towering figure still, arms folded, eyes locked on the judge. In that charged silence, every heartbeat counted. Outside, social media feeds blinked animatedly. Justice for Shaq, expose the cover-up, heart-knot headlines, flooding timelines with pressure that could no longer be ignored. At last, the judge's voice broke the hush. "All charges against Shaq O'Neal are hereby dismissed." The words landed, not explosive, but seismic. A collective exhale rose from the courtroom, as supporters erupted into relieved applause. Prosecutors sank with measured solemnity. Defense attorneys shared tight smiles. Shaq's gaze remained calm, absorbing everything, carrying every moment of dread that led to this quiet conclusion. He stood and walked forward, each step imbued with dignity, rather than bravado. No raised fists, no dramatic proclamations, just presence. As the doors opened, another wave greeted him. Cameras, chants, hopeful voices, but nothing overshadowed one figure at the front: Lucille O'Neal, her face radiant with relief and pride. She rushed to him, wrapping her arms around her son. Their embrace spoke volumes: unfiltered love, proven faith, and the triumph of truth. Amid the cheers, Shaq's attention landed on a young boy, no more than 8, standing on tiptoes as he shouted, "You saved him, Big Shaq." The crowd hushed, as though acknowledging an honest truth. Shaq managed a slow smile and raised a hand, not in victory but in acknowledgement of a truth affirmed by generations. No fireworks burst from his lips. Instead, he nodded at Lucille, then nodded again at the crowd. "Thank you," he said softly, voice steady and clear. "I did what any person should do, and I did it because someone needed help." The crowd responded with a chorus of applause, the sentiment deeper than celebration. It was affirmation. Before stepping into a waiting vehicle, he took a moment to scan the faces around him: attorneys who fought with him, students holding up signs, families who saw their own struggles echoed in his. He gave a final nod and slipped into the car, headlights scanning the courthouse steps one last time as his image rippled across the nation. The scene shifted to a local community center, where Shaq addressed a small gathering afterward. He didn't bask in vindication. He leaned in, voice earnest and grounded. This victory isn't about headlines or fame. It's about every person cast in the wrong story, people of color, people without voice, who need confirmation that truth matters. He spoke of perseverance, the strength of community, and how justice often grows from solidarity rather than courts. His message landed in steady resolve rather than heroic. In the days that followed, local news covered the community celebration. Candlelight vigils morphed into mentorship, drive days. Free Big Shaq organized pro bono legal clinics for wrongly accused individuals. College forums expanded into action committees. The ripple extended beyond one man. It touched systemic undercurrents, inspired policy conversations about algorithmic bias, and became a case study in justice fueled by public will. Shawnee appeared beside him in interviews, her voice tight with emotion but firm. This was never just about proving innocence. It was about reminding us all, those waiting on bail, those waiting for their stories to be seen, that sometimes truth doesn't just walk through courthouse doors. It emerges from every voice that says, "I believe you." Her words stayed on airwaves, stirring more belief. For Shaq, the journey didn't end with dismissal. It deepened his purpose. He returned to expanding scholarships and nonprofit efforts he'd begun before the scandal. But now each program carried a new mission: education on systemic bias, tools for digital advocacy, resources for legal defense. He spoke regularly on behalf of racial justice organizations, his platform renewed by lessons of how quickly perception can override truth, and how louder truth can return it. 2 weeks after the verdict, Shaq hosted a public event at the same community center where the local rally happened. Lucille introduced him among cheering families and community leaders. He stood before a banner that read, "Truth, Dignity, Action." He began, "We won today because people demanded to see beyond assumptions." He paused, eyes sweeping the audience. "Our work continues, because there are so many whose stories haven't yet been heard, and if they wait for a system that's slow to believe them, they might never get justice." The applause that followed was not for a celebrity cleared. It was for a man who used his clearing to uplift others, still unfree. The young boy from the courthouse, now holding a signed basketball, stood beside him. Shaq knocked 2 big knuckles on the kid's ball and said, "Play by your truths, keep going." In that moment, the lesson crystallized. Sometimes, justice doesn't come from the court. It comes from the crowd, who refuses to let silence speak. And sometimes, a single act of courage becomes an example far larger than any courtroom. Shaq had emptied his hands in defense, but filled them in purpose, and the world had seen the difference. Redemption isn't loud, it's steady. Months after the courtroom drama faded from headlines, Shaquille O'Neal walked onto the basketball court at the Silvergate Community Center where he'd first volunteered years ago. It was early morning, sun spilling through gym windows, dust motes dancing in golden light, an atmosphere not grandeur but nurture. The kids were already there, a diverse group of teens clutching basketballs, waiting for his arrival. They didn't call him Big Shaq today. They called him Coach, a title he wore with humble pride. As he approached, a murmur of excitement rippled through the group. But the coach they knew wasn't legendary for athletic feats. He was legendary for his heart, his patience, his ability to see potential in overlooked youth. He started the session not with drills but with conversation. He asked each kid about their dreams, some hesitant, others bold, but each voice mattered. When one shy teenager admitted fear of being judged for mistakes, Shaq leaned forward, voice steady. "Mistakes don't define you, they shape you." He spoke not as the world's basketball titan, but as a man who had been boxed by perception and refused to be contained. The court became a classroom of purpose. No cheers from fans, no media cameras, just the steady bounce of balls and the rhythm of encouragement. The coach taught fundamentals of shooting and passing, but his deeper lessons were invisible yet lasting: resilience, dignity, self-belief. Later that afternoon, Shaq sat at his office desk, a simple wooden surface adorned with letters from students. One envelope carried a drawing of Shaq towering over haters, heart shining. Another held a typed thank you from a teen wrongly suspended at school, crediting Shaq's talk as courage to speak out. With each message, Shaq's eyes softened. He had pledged to go beyond mentorship. He would launch the Truth Rises Scholarship, aimed at kids falsely accused or racially profiled. The program would fund college tuition, counseling, and legal support when needed. The paperwork lay ready, but more than logistics filled his mind: legacy. That evening, At a modest ceremony, under gym bleachers, children, parents, community leaders, and Lucille gathered. Shaq spoke with a voice that carried firm hope rather than a plea. This scholarship exists because too many voices are silenced, not by law, but by fear. It's not just money, it's message. You matter. He looked over the faces illuminated by string lights. Believing eyes, tear-wet ones, hopeful ones. No cameras, just a community recognizing courage. Days later, Shaq contributed op-ed columns for newspapers and educational platforms. One newsletter headline read, "Beyond the Court, Coaching Truth and Justice." His writing laid bare the lessons he'd learned, that fame doesn't insulate you from injustice. It can magnify it, but it also allows you to challenge it. He wrote of knowing that standing down in court allowed systems to ignore history. Standing up on the court of life created accountability. His words resonated across readerships. Teachers assigned the columns for class discussions. Community groups used them to spark dialogue. Meanwhile, colleges previously silent in the scandal reached out. One university established a research fellowship focused on algorithmic bias and racial profiling, naming it after Shaq's scholarship. Suddenly, his experience had rippled into academic reform. It felt surreal, from forced isolation in a cell to institutional change driven by evidence and empathy. In quieter moments, Shaq reflected on how personal grief had woven into purpose. He often revisited that closing line in his mind. When the world tries to put you in a box, don't shrink, expand. He had lived it. The box hadn't contained his talent, his kindness, or his dignity, even when institutions tried. Instead, he'd grown bigger, deeper, more purposeful. One afternoon, on a local news segment, he appeared with one of the scholarship recipients, a senior named Tasha, determined to study law and fight wrongful convictions. She spoke of how Shaq's action changed her perspective on what role models can do. She said, "He didn't just clear his name, he built a path for us." Shaq responded humbly, "We all need paths. I just helped cut one." That night, as the center emptied and the lights dimmed, Shaq sat alone in the empty stands, sneakers on the steps. In the hush, his voice joined a final reflection for a documentary crew filming his journey. "The courtroom vindicated me on paper," he said softly, tone reflective. "But redemption happens here, in these courts, and in these hearts. Real victory isn't loud, it's steady. It's showing up again, and again." The camera caught him looking down at the court. He continued, "Let the truth ride higher than the lies." His words hovered over the gym. A promise, a credo. Not for fans, not for fame, but for every single kid who needs to know. Freedom starts when you refuse to let fear define your story. In that silent gym, with walls bearing echoes of sneakers and whispers of hope, Shaq found his high ground, not at the top of fame, but at the intersection where purpose meets resilience. Where greatness isn't proven by applause, but by impact carried in steady, unshakable steps. If this story moved you, if it made you think, feel, or question the world we live in, don't let it end here. Subscribe to the channel for more powerful, true-to-life narratives that challenge injustice and shine a light where others won't. Like the video if it resonated with you, and share it with someone who needs to be reminded that truth still has a voice. Let's keep these stories alive, because the more we share, the stronger we stand.